In 1886, a Paris printing house finished a book of a few hundred pages, and within weeks its author ordered nearly the entire run destroyed. The plates went too. Accounts differ on how many copies survived, 2, perhaps a handful, but the author kept one for himself and said very little about why. His name was Joseph Alexandre Saint-Yves d'Alvard, a French esotericist with aristocratic manners and an interest in political theory. The book was called Mission de l'Inde en Europe. In it, he described a subterranean civilization beneath Central Asia, governed by a hierarchy of initiates, with a population he numbered in the millions. He gave it a name, Agartha. He described its schools, its libraries, its system of government, its underground passages branching outward beneath the continents. He wrote about it the way a man writes about a country he has visited, with the flat confidence of an administrator filing a report, rather than a mystic having a vision. Then he destroyed the book. His heirs republished it in 1910 after his death, and that version is the one the world eventually read. But the 24-year silence in between is a strange shape in the record, and the reason usually given for it is thin. What the book actually says is stranger than its reputation, and duller in a way that makes it worse. Saint-Yves does not write like a man reporting a vision. He writes like a man describing an institution he has studied, its offices, its succession, its filing systems. Agartha, in his account, is governed by what he called synarchy, authority divided into 3 permanent bodies, one for teaching, one for justice, one for economic life, none of them able to override the others. He had already proposed this system for Europe in earlier books. Here it appears as the working original. At the summit he places a sovereign he calls the Brahmatma, flanked by 2 assistants, the Mahatma and the Mahanga. Below them, descending circles of initiates, each admitted by examination rather than birth. It is a civil service. That is the register the entire book is written in. The population he gives is roughly 20 million. He does not defend the figure, does not explain how it was arrived at, does not round it apologetically, the way a man inventing a number tends to. He states it once, and moves on to describe how they are educated. The education is where he lingers longest. He describes vast subterranean libraries, records cut into stone rather than written on anything perishable, and a primordial alphabet he calls Vattan, from which he claims the later scripts of the surface world descend. He reproduces characters from it. He treats it as recoverable. He also gives a date. Agartha withdrew beneath the surface, he says, around 3200 BCE, at the opening of the age Hindu cosmology calls the Kali Yuga, a retreat from a world becoming unfit for it. From there, the passages branch outward, running beneath continents, surfacing at points he declines to specify, and they still send people up. That is the part with political consequences, and I suspect it is the part that mattered to him. Emissaries move through surface history, he writes, advising, correcting, occasionally intervening, unrecognized. The book's stated purpose is to petition them, to ask Agartha to make itself known to Europe. His source for all this was a man he called Haji Sharif, a Sanskrit tutor who worked with him at Le Havre in the mid-1880s, and whom Saint-Yves described as attached to the Agarthian school. Their sessions are recorded in his notebooks. Whatever else was happening, the tutor existed. But Saint-Yves also claimed to have reached the place himself without moving, a journey undertaken in some non-physical state, which he reports in the same flat voice as everything else. He never marks where testimony ends and vision begins. The two are braided together on the page, deliberately or otherwise. Then he pulped it. The explanations that circulate are all reconstructions after the fact, that he had broken a condition of secrecy, that his teacher objected, that he saw how the book would be received and lost his nerve. I have found no contemporary document in which he states a reason. The mainstream explanation for the whole affair is not only reasonable, it is almost certainly correct in its essentials, and it deserves laying out properly rather than waving past. It has two parts. The first is geological, and it is close to airtight. The geological part is close to airtight. In 1936, the Danish seismologist Inge Lehmann demonstrated from the behavior of seismic waves that Earth has a solid inner core. Since then, tomography, the planet's mass, and its moment of inertia have described a body dense the whole way down. Whatever Agartha is, there is no cavity to hold it. The second part is literary. Tibetan Buddhism contains a genuine tradition of Shambala, a northern kingdom described in the Kalachakra literature, alongside the Baal, hidden valleys attributed to Padmasambhava, understood at once as real terrain and as sacred concealment. The double reading is native to the tradition, not imposed on it, so the standard account writes itself. European esotericists encountered fragments of this through translation and colonial scholarship, mistook a symbolic register for literal geography, and built an underground empire out of a metaphor. That is not a conspiracy. That is ordinary cultural misunderstanding, and it happens constantly. Louis Jacoliot, a French colonial magistrate, published material in 1873 mentioning a place he rendered as Agartha. Helena Blavatsky wove Shambala into her cosmology in 1888. Saint-Yves sits in that current, not outside it. The scholarship on this is careful and largely persuasive, and for most purposes it ought to be the end of the matter. Here is the detail that does not sit flat inside that explanation, and I want to introduce it without any weight attached, because it is small. In 1922, a Polish chemist named Ferdynand Osendowski published Beasts, Men and Gods, an account of his flight across Siberia and Mongolia during the Russian Civil War. Among the campfire testimony he recorded from lamas and Mongol princes was a description of a subterranean kingdom called Agartha, ruled by a figure he called the King of the World. The parallels with Saint-Yves are close, not identical, but close. The underground realm, the hidden sovereign, the tunnels, the hierarchy. And when René Guénon set the two texts side by side in 1927, he noted that either Osendowski had read Saint-Yves or both men had drawn on the same source. Osendowski denied reading Saint-Yves. The plagiarism charge was pressed hard. Sven Hedin, the great Swedish explorer of Central Asia and no friend of loose claims, published an entire volume in 1925 attacking Osendowski's reliability. Much of what Hedin said landed. Osendowski was a storyteller with a storyteller's relationship to precision, and I would not build anything on his word alone. But notice the shape of the accusation. To accuse Osendowski of plagiarism, you have to believe he read a book that its own author had suppressed and destroyed in a language he read imperfectly, and then reproduced its central geography from memory while fleeing an army across Mongolia in winter. That is not impossible, it is simply an unusual amount of work. And there is a third possibility, that neither Genon nor Hedin could rule out, and neither wanted much, that Mongol and Tibetan informants in 1920 were describing something they had heard from their own teachers, and that Saint-Yves in 1886 had received a version of the same material through his Sanskrit tutor decades earlier. Two men drinking from one well, that is the first crack, and I want to leave it exactly that size. It is not evidence of an underground civilization. It is evidence that a specific and detailed story was circulating in Central Asia before Europeans could plausibly have exported it there, which is a much smaller claim and a much harder one to dismiss. Now the thing that made me keep reading, which is that the story does not stay in books. In 1775, the third Panchen Lama, Palden Yeshe, composed a text usually translated as the guidebook to Shambala, not a poem, not a devotional hymn, a route description, landmarks, distances, the sequence of obstacles a traveller would meet moving north. One of the most senior figures in Tibetan Buddhism wrote what reads, "In places like an itinerary." You can argue, scholars do, and they are probably right, that the guidebook describes an inner journey in outer clothing, a meditative progression mapped onto imagined terrain. Tibetan literature does this often and does it beautifully. I accept that reading. I simply note that the text itself does not tell you it is a metaphor, and its readers have not always taken it as one, because between 1925 and 1928, Nicholas Roerich crossed Central Asia looking for it. Roerich was not a crank on the margins. He was a Russian painter of international reputation, a stage designer for Stravinsky, a man whose international treaty on the protection of cultural property was signed at the White House in 1935. He was serious, and he was funded. His expedition carried Shambala as an explicit organizing theme. His published diaries, Altai Himalaya, record his questions to lamas, the answers he received, the persistent local insistence that the kingdom was reachable. In August 1926, near Kukunoor, he recorded the expedition watching a shining oval object move across the sky and change direction, and the lamas present interpreting it as a sign. I have gone back and forth on that entry for a long time. A high-altitude balloon, a lenticular cloud, an aircraft, a misremembered light, any of these could produce it. And Roerich was a man predisposed to see meaning. Doubt is cheap here, and I am spending it freely. But the entry is contemporaneous, and he wrote it down before he had a use for it. What I cannot dismiss as easily is who was paying attention. In the 1930s, Roerich's Manchurian expedition was funded by the United States Department of Agriculture under Secretary Henry Wallace, who later became vice president. The stated purpose was collecting drought-resistant grasses. The correspondence between them was strange enough that it ended Wallace's political career when it surfaced. Hold that, a sitting American cabinet secretary financed the Central Asian expeditions of a man openly searching for Shambala, and the official file said seeds. Now go east and back to the Soviet Union in the same decade. Gleb Boki ran the cryptographic section of the OGPU, one of the most powerful men in Soviet state security. Together with the occult researcher Alexander Barchenko, he pursued an expedition to Central Asia in search of an ancient hidden science. This is not folklore. It is in the interrogation record. The expedition was blocked by internal rivalry and never went. Barchenko was arrested and executed in 1938. Boki was shot in 1937. Their files were sealed for decades and emerged only after 1991, which is why almost no one writing about Agartha before that date knew the Soviet thread existed at all. And in 1938, a German expedition entered Tibet under the zoologist Ernst Schaefer, financed through Heinrich Himmler's Ahnenerbe. Schaefer spent the rest of his life insisting his work was ornithology, geophysics, and ethnography, and much of it demonstrably was. He resisted Himmler's occult enthusiasms and said so repeatedly. I think he was largely telling the truth, but you must sit with the arrangement itself. Himmler, who believed a great deal of nonsense with total sincerity, put money into Tibet. The expedition brought back measurements, films, and a treaty overture to Lhasa. Whatever Schaefer wanted, the man writing the checks wanted something else, and the check cleared. So here is the pattern, laid out flat. Between roughly 1920 and 1940, the intelligence or state apparatus of Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, and the United States each put resources towards Central Asian expeditions in which the Shambala question was present, sometimes as the stated goal, sometimes as the thing everyone declined to state. These were not allies. Bokier's service existed to destroy the Germans and the Americans both. The Ahnenerbe regarded Bolshevism as a biological enemy. Wallace's department had no earthly business in Manchuria. There was no coordinating body, no shared archive, no meeting where this was agreed. And yet the behavior rhymes. I want to give the strongest version of the objection, because it is a good one. The 1920s and 1930s were the terminal phase of the Great Game. Central Asia was the seam where three empires ground against each other. Tibet was a strategic vacuum, and any state with ambitions in Asia had obvious reasons to send men there. And prophecy was a liver. If you want to move Mongol and Tibetan populations, you do not lecture them on dialectical materialism or racial science. You speak in the idiom of Shambala, because that idiom already moves them. The Bolsheviks understood this explicitly. So did others. Expedition and propaganda operation can wear the same coat. That explanation covers most of it. I think it covers the American case almost entirely, and much of the German one. It is unglamorous, it is documented, and I would rather be right and bored than wrong and interesting. If you take nothing else from this, take that sentence. What it does not cover is the filing, because in every one of these cases, the Shambhala component was recorded as something else. Grasses, ornithology, cryptography, and applied science. The public record of each expedition, in three mutually hostile states, buried the same element under a different cover, and did so without any of them consulting the others, which raises a question I have not found a clean answer to. What kind of pressure produces identical omissions in archives that were never in contact? I do not think it was conspiracy, and I want to be precise about why. Conspiracy requires an architect, and there is no architect here. There is no name you can put at the center of this. Every attempt I have seen to supply one collapses under 10 minutes of checking, and I have checked them. What I think happened is duller, and to me considerably worse. Every institution involved had its own independent reason to keep this off the ledger. The Americans could not admit to funding mysticism with farm money. The Germans could not admit their science service was chasing legends. The Soviets could not admit that a senior Chekist believed in hidden knowledge. None of them needed to speak to one another. They needed only to share an interest in appearing rational, and the silence assembled itself out of that shared interest, the way a crowd finds an exit without anyone directing it. This is what institutional convergence looks like from the outside, and it is indistinguishable from design. And that indistinguishability is the actual problem. Because if uncoordinated actors can produce a record that looks coordinated, then the tidiness of an archive tells you nothing about whether it is complete. The absence of a document is not evidence of suppression, but it is not evidence of absence either, and we treat it as though it were. So where does that leave the underground kingdom beneath Tibet? Nowhere, physically. The seismology said so early, and I will not soften it now. There is no cavity, no tunnel network, no city of millions under the plateau. The rock is solid, and the seismology is not negotiable. But strip the geology away, and something remains that I cannot get rid of. A specific narrative with specific structural features appearing in Tibetan doctrinal literature, in Mongol oral testimony, in a suppressed French book, in a Polish refugee's memoir, and in the operational interests of 3 governments that agreed on nothing else. The conventional answer is diffusion, that the idea simply travelled, as ideas do, and that I am mistaking the spread of a story for the persistence of a fact. That is probably true. Most of the time, when something appears in many places, the reason is that it moved between them. I know this. Then explain the direction of travel to me. Because the European version arrives late and arrives already detailed, and the Asian sources it supposedly contaminated were describing the same architecture before the contamination could have reached them, and every attempt to reverse the arrow requires someone to have read a book that had been pulped. I have exhausted what I can do with this. I have read the debunkings and found most of them sound. I have watched my own reasoning for the places where it wants to lean, and I have cut those places out. What is left is not a discovery, it is a residue, and residue is not proof of anything. Here is what I keep arriving at instead, and I offer it without confidence. We have been asking whether there is a place under Tibet. That question is settled. The question we have not asked is why so many serious people, in so many incompatible systems of belief, kept behaving as though there were, and why each of them chose to write down something other than what they were doing. Somewhere in the record of the 20th century, there is a category of activity that 3 enemy governments independently decided not to name. Agartha may be nothing more than the shape that category happens to take when it becomes visible. The route the Panchen Lama described leads north. Nobody I can find has ever gone to the end of it and written down what was there.